Dear viewers, despite thoroughly enjoying them at the time, Pokémon X and Y are games that over the years I have come to lightly resent. While they did accomplish the tricky technical task of bringing Pokémon into the third dimension with laudable finesse, they were in some ways a willful step backwards. Generation 5, the previous set of games, made a distinctive turn toward greater ambition for the series to do new things, especially narratively. Generation 6, X and Y, in contrast chose not to build on that momentum and were for the most part more of the same, and, what's worse, seemed to be making a point of being more of the same. They are games broadly committed to familiarity, their biggest mechanical innovation being exceptionally crowd-friendly and thus marketable. You know, you guys like Charizard, right? Well, he's back, and now he can evolve again. Twice, for some reason. I speak a bit too cynically, though, because alongside my criticisms, I also believe these games were treated unfairly. Pokémon as a whole moved on from them with unprecedented haste. Almost unbelievably, they never made a Pokémon Z. And this wouldn't be a problem if they actually had nothing to offer, but it can't be that simple. Just when you think X and Y's sparklingly smooth surface is all there is to see, strange little ideas start bubbling underneath. So, with the series returning to Kalos ahead of schedule next year, now seems a good time to dig in and re-examine this odd pair of games, both in comparison to the 5th generation, but also as a standalone work of art. Because, of course, any work of art, flawed in whatever way, is still a unique expression of life. Welcome to Reconstructed. In many ways, Pokémon X and Y delivered the clearest and most capable expression yet of everything Pokémon is traditionally supposed to be. Every advantage granted by the more powerful console was leveraged to create an experience closer to the idealized imagination of Pokémon in the minds of 6-year-olds the world over. To start, the collaborative nature of the games is here emphasized and expanded. There is a potent loneliness to playing Pokémon X on an emulator in 2024. The player search system screen sits empty, no longer filled with the faces of friends, acquaintances, and passersby alike, lovely features like Wonder Trade, Battle Spot, and O-Powers Gathering Dust. Did anyone actually use O-Powers? I'm not exactly sure, but you could. You could send various buffs and upgrades to other real people playing the games, and they could send them back. This was, on release, a great strength of X and Y that they were not just a personal adventure, but, visibly and audibly, a shared adventure with millions of people from all across the Earth. Even though, yes, Wonder Trade usually returned a Bunnelby or Bidoof, the real possibility of getting a shiny Articuno instead was enthralling, even if it was probably hacked. Whatever people did in these games was done together. This carries through to the game's narrative. Instead of an individual rival character, in X and Y you have a friend group. You are joined in your travels by Shauna, Trevor, Tierno, and, depending on the player character's gender, either Serena or Column. Serena, as I'll be referring to her to match the footage, is the more prototypical rival, the next-door neighbor specifically interested in battling and competitive in nature, but not to the point of creating any real animosity. The other three are motivated differently, though. Shauna is there for the social aspect, just wanting to make friends and have fun. Trevor is focused on completing the Pokédex, and Tierno loves dancing. You might think, dancing isn't really a Pokémon mechanic, and you'd be right, but that isn't going to stop Tierno. Your friends pop up here and there throughout the region to help you out and engage you in very simple conversation. Aside from Serena, these aren't really characters with a discernible arc. They don't have problems, aside from whatever temporary roadblock the villains are imposing. What I find most interesting about them is how they reflect the real experience of being a young kid around young kids who all like Pokémon. There are so many ways to engage with the games that most children will naturally fixate on one or two rather than the whole thing holistically. Despite being the defining mechanic, the battles are a bit too complex to compel most kids, especially when mashing attack moves with an overleveled starter will pretty much get you to the end of the game. I, for one, if you couldn't already tell, was a Trevor. My motivation was always first to discover and collect as many magic critters as I could. I remember being appalled that my church friend had reached the 5th gym but only caught 4 Pokemon. Like, you're missing the point, Adam. So having 4 companions, only one of which is into the fighting, feels realer to me. However, battles are still the defining mechanic beyond which all forms of progression are locked, and the game feels lost or just uninterested in writing characters that do things other than battle. So you end up with moments toward the end of the game like battling Shauna, who now has a level 49 Goodra despite her never indicating any interest in raising a Pokemon like that, but this is what we get because X and Y don't seem to have any other tools for wrapping up a character relationship. There is more to say about Serena, but I have a different problem with her character that I'll touch on later. All in all, these were not characters ever destined for complexity. Their dialogue is written in a way I don't want to call dumbed down because that's a little too connotatively negative, so I will instead call it simplified. But you've already gotten my point. If you were old enough to read complete sentences, you were old enough to understand all of the interactions between the player character and their friends. They exist right alongside the various co-op features to successfully communicate that Pokemon is about community and friendship between people, and they don't attempt to do anything else. In general, X and Y have a conspicuous drive to make the experience maximally accessible. This has become a core part of the game's legacy, being the point where Pokemon became too easy. The experience share item now distributes XP generously among all Pokemon in the party, which effectively trivializes any challenge in the game. The comfortable counterpoint is that it can be turned off, but because I was born in the 1900s, I of course play without the experience share, and even with my mediocre battling skills, the game was strictly not difficult, save maybe for the champion battle thanks to a big level spike. I did have to actually strategize to get past the Mega Gardevoir, if you count using light screen as strategy. Here we see that the front-facing Pokemon experience is and will be for the kids first. Their fun is the priority. And if you are clever enough to conquer the game with no challenge, you are clever enough to invent your own difficulty if that's what you prefer. This is fine completely. A slight shame that most of this design decision is condensed into not clicking the win button off, but only slight. And there are a few brand new mechanics that do technically make the game easier, but in a subtler and more rewarding way, and which also fulfill that long idealized imagination of Pokemon. Finally, you can pet them. Pokemon Ami is a minigame that turns your whole team into Nintendogs. By brushing them with the stylus, feeding them colorful macaroons, and playing low-effort activities, the player can simulate a personal relationship with each of their digital friends. It doesn't matter how 26 I am now, I still do get a little dopamine hit seeing those hearts pop out. I truly believe I have just made my friend Lucario happy. There's an inherent light-hearted humor to Pokemon Ami as well. It doesn't matter how much of a god the Pokemon is supposed to be or how much it doesn't look like it has a mouth, it will still enjoy its head pats and tasty treats. I can only speak for myself, but the fantasy of becoming friends with magical animals is a huge part of the psychological appeal of Pokemon, and this mechanic takes full advantage of the graphical advancement to indulge in that fantasy as much as possible. Frankly, it is a minor miracle that every Pokemon ever has a complete 3D model and set of animations to flesh out this feature. A tremendous amount of labor resulted in what I view as a very worthwhile addition to the game. Pokemon Ami happens to be the exact sort of thing that the 5th generation sorely needed narratively, because the game distinctly rewards the player for treating their Pokemon with love. As a Pokemon's affection level increases, spontaneous positive effects occur in battle, such as dodging an attack, shaking off a status effect, or landing an extra critical hit. These happen infrequently enough that they can't be relied on, but will still get you out of a pinch several times across a playthrough. If you care for your Pokemon, they will care for you back. It's sweet. Complementary to Pokemon Ami is Super Training, another 3D minigame this time focused on improving battle-relevant statistics. Super Training makes accessible effort value training, a long obscure aspect of Pokemon. And by using imagery of sports and workouts, it functions as a subtle counter to the idea of Pokemon battles as abusive, an idea that, very contrary to the 5th generation, X and Y never even mentions. The visuals, though, imply that battling Pokemon is not dogfighting, it's athletics. For today, I'm gonna say sure. There's no punishment for not engaging with Super Training besides a slightly weaker team, but if you are specifically interested in powering up your Pokemon as much as possible, the path to doing so is clear as day. Talking about so many of the new features first does, however, sort of misrepresent the game because so much of what you do is exactly in line with the Pokemon mold. There are precisely 8 gyms with a distinct type theme. There is a team of flashy, uniformed villains. There are caves, fields, and beaches that need to be accessed with strength and cut and surf. There are a lot of Pokemon available to catch, but fewer brand new ones than any other generation. Likely a necessary result of having to craft new models for all past Pokemon as well, the relative lack of newbies does result in the region having a tad less unique local flavor. All of these familiar shapes reduce friction. There is less to learn, so the game slides more smoothly under your fingers. One could argue that risk was kept low because X and Y were meant to appeal to small children on a new console, so it was best to go with a guaranteed formula. Another layer though is that X and Y were also meant to appeal specifically to people who grew up with the first generation of Pokemon, who by 2013 were broadly adults. After all the backlash to Black and White including only new Pokemon, it can't be a coincidence that you can't go 2 steps in X and Y without the game throwing Pidgeys and Caterpies and even Pikachus right in your face. When you arrive in the 4th city in the game, the professor just hand delivers you your choice of Generation 1 starter. You may see that I picked Squirtle in the footage, but that was only because I already had Chespin. I've been a die-hard Bulbasaur fan since day 1, and I need you all to know that about me. This is an anti-Charmander household, I'm sorry. Soon after, you encounter a Snorlax blocking the road. What do you need to wake it up? Why yes, it is the Pokéflute. How did you know? In the post-game, you can find Articuno, Zapdos, Moltres, and Mewtwo. The game's colors are literally red and blue. I could go on, but I've already exhausted all my examples. Still, it's enough that it feels less like X and Y is just referencing Generation 1 and more like they're leaning on it. And I'm not going to say the word pandering, except for when I just did. As a longtime Gen 5 defender, it's hard not to see this as an apology to the people who were genuinely angry at Black and White's minor divergence from Blueprint. Paired with the 5th generation's financial underperformance, the constant Kanto illusions in Gen 6 read to a cynic as the game cooing to a disposable income audience. Shh, it's okay, I'm here. Nothing will ever change. Please don't go. But things do change. Pokemon X and Y are their own unique set of games despite their willingness to obfuscate that fact. It is a real feat of design that they feel so comfortably similar to their predecessors while being built from scratch. They are not at all lacking in new features, yet don't intrude on people's preconceptions of Pokemon because those features precisely fulfill that long idealized imagination. The merit of choosing to stay within preconceptions is another topic, but that they did so proficiently under high pressure deserves admiration in its own right. Even the unhideably new elements are kept impressively frictionless. The introduction of a fairy type was potentially disruptive, but the game chose not to overbear with it. Fairies are very much present, but the player is never forced to use them or understand their competitive ramifications. There is a fairy gym, but the gyms are consistently easy and it's unlikely the player will come in with an abundance of dragon types. It's like they'd always been there, and yeah, it sounds wrong now that Clefairy and Togepi were just normal type for over a decade. A smooth integration. When X and Y does something fresh, it is also careful to conceptualize and implement it so as to put off as few people as possible. This extends to the defining aesthetic of the setting. Never before has Pokemon been French. To say that the region of Kalos was inspired by France is a clear understatement. Its shape and style could hardly be Frencher. This is a diversion from the early generations who were all based on regions of Japan. Generation 5's Unova was based on New York City, but only loosely, used as a jumping-off point consistent with the story's theme of diversity. So why is Kalos France? Because France is pretty. According to director Junichi Masuda, one of the themes of Pokemon X and Y is beauty. Kalos is actually the ancient Greek word for beauty, and I thought France fit that ideal. I've traveled in my own time to places for inspiration, and France really stuck out in my mind. One of the reasons we base Pokemon settings on real-world places is that we think it'd be fun for players to discover real-world similarities. End quote. France, or at least an idealized French aesthetic, has long held a lot of cultural sway in Japan and America alike. In the English-speaking world, it is cultural common knowledge that if there is a global capital of art and beauty and romance, it is Paris. Japan's most famous 20th century landmark is the same shape as the Eiffel Tower and only 3 meters taller. There is a named, if probably spurious psychiatric condition called Paris syndrome, where tourists experience delusional states due to profound disappointment at the reality of traveling to France. Kalos is much more in line with that imaginary idealization of France than it is with the real thing. Look, I've been to Paris and I had a great time. It's the only place I've ever thrown up on the street. That's not a point, it's just funny. But alongside its marvels, there is, as a natural consequence to its bigness and busyness, a roughness that is impossible to not see. Despite how it's often advertised, Paris is not a theme park but a place people live, which is of course ultimately much more interesting. Lumiose City, though, feels like a pristinely kept theme park. As enjoyable as roller skating along its alleys and canals can be when the camera is behaving, it is an obviously incomplete analog to Paris. While discovering its multitudinous cafes, museums, and swanky hotels does often feel like exploring a real metropolis, it is only in the friendliest possible way. Aside from one route where the player may encounter disaffected youths, Kalos as a whole is uniformly gorgeous and colorful and clean. These games avoid friction after all, and even though the imitation is blatant, it doesn't run very deep. The town's beginning to feel samey as the game runs out of widespread French associations. All this is to say that I don't think X and Y are set in France due to an ardent interest in the country, but because they recognize its utility in advertising. Putting an on-the-nose Eiffel Tower in an on-the-nose version of a city that so many people in your target markets dream of visiting is free attention. I do like Kalos. I think it's fun to explore. There are some real standout areas. However, like so much of X and Y, the core driving force behind its identity was to appeal to as many people as possible. Make more friends than ever before, catch more Pokemon than ever before, and love them like never before, but all exactly like you had already imagined you would. A new region, but dominated by familiar cultural shorthand. Nostalgia in spades and novelty in moderation, these were games designed to make an excellent trailer. Now, you may be wondering, on this channel that looks at games as stories, why I haven't talked about the plot yet. When creating a mainline Pokemon game, the storyline is never going to be the selling point, but is still necessary for the experience to function. Masada says the theme is beauty, and whether that was post-hoc to marketing choices or not, there is some intriguing elaboration on that idea. X and Y contain characters obsessed with beauty, prioritizing beauty over the existence of certain kinds of people. Despite all the elsewhere avoidance of friction, make no mistake, these games are about fascism. Something typically kept invisible in Pokemon worlds is politics. That's not to say that political meaning can't be derived from the storylines, but the actual structure of these societies are usually unexplored. I'm not asking to know the tax rate or learn how they fund their infrastructure, but usually we have no idea who, if anyone, is in charge. This isn't strictly a negative or a positive, just a thing worth noting that has downstream effects. Kalos is the same, but only in the present. X and Y find opportunities throughout the story to refer back to versions of Kalos centuries and even millennia in the past, and this temporal separation, for whatever reason, allows the games to discuss monarchy and the inequality it creates to depict, if obliquely, strife and violence and war. A key example of this occurs the first time the game set up and resolve a minor conflict. Snorlax is blocking the path, and only the owner of the nearby Shabano Castle knows how to wake it. Despite being a castle, Shabano is described as a modest building, built of simple stone and lacking decoration. The nobility it belongs to have long prioritized the health of the community over hoarding wealth, even selling off property to meet that goal, including the suddenly necessary Pokeflute. The player, accompanied by Shauna, must then retrieve it from the absurdly opulent gold-plated Parfume Palace. Throughout the palace, both Shauna and various NPCs express overt disdain for the ostentatious nature of the building and its owner, who is obviously childish and self-important. This transparent stand-in for the Palace of Versailles was explicitly created by a king from 300 years ago, funded by the spoils of war. It's all very Louis XIV, complete with the undercurrent of inequity and social unrest. Engaging with the real history of France necessitates engaging with the reality of violence, and Pokémon X and Y have, perhaps unexpectedly, chosen to do so. After you find his missing poodle, Parfum's owner lights some fireworks and agrees to return the flute to its rightful place. Snorlax is then awakened and the region reconnects. Across this little plotline, there is a direct anti-aristocracy message. Parfum Palace is more traditionally beautiful than Chabanneau Castle, but its beauty is empty and even harmful. The true beauty is instead found in the selflessness and dignity of the castle. Thus, condensation of wealth in the hands of few over many is bad, period. It's an easy-to-read political parable. People are more important than aesthetics. The game doesn't invest a lot of resources into this mini-narrative. The owners don't even have unique character models. It's the sort of early story event that isn't an end itself, but a microcosm to set up the themes of the later, more developed conflict. Unfortunately, it may also be the last time Pokémon X and Y is comprehensively written. I will try my best to give the main plot a fair shake, and it has a lot more than nothing to say, but it absolutely has a tendency to step on its own feet, or even not step at all, shoes hovering eerily above the pavement. Our main villain, identifiable as such on the first frame of his appearance, is Lysander. Lysander is the owner of a tech company that makes the holographic communication devices called holocasters that are popular across Kalos. He is also the leader of Team Flare, a garishly dressed gang committing blatant crimes all over the region. Once the player gets past the Snorlax, Team Flare becomes the only problem for the rest of the game, and they're not exactly a complex problem. They believe, simply, that because they have slicker style and more money that they are inherently better, more worthy people than all outsiders. Among other things, they kidnap scientists, commandeer power plants and Pokeball factories, and harass local wildlife, all solely in service of collecting all the energy and resources of Kalos for Team Flare to own. Lysander, despite the apparent aesthetic connection, remains unsuspected by the general public and is in fact a popular figure. He is interestingly a close friend and colleague of Professor Sycamore, the charismatic professor who sent you on your journey in the first place. Every time you bump into Lysander, he launches into monologues about how desperately he desires the most beautiful world possible, with increasingly sinister statements about which kind of human beings belong there. People can be divided into two groups, those who give and those who take. It's just as how the Kalos region's two legendary Pokemon gave life and took life. I want to be the kind of person who gives, but in this world some foolish humans exist who would show their strength by taking what isn't theirs. Their filth. Lysander is also the descendant of an ancient king. This is a cartoonish and simplified yet ultimately accurate depiction of fascist rhetoric. Lysander's belief that only a certain type of person, a certain type of life has value, and that any problems in society are caused by undesirables stealing resources is a direct reflection of very real fascist movements in the history of Europe and beyond. This isn't going to be the video to over-explain the academic definition of fascism, so I'll just say I know it when I see it. His use of the word filth in particular hangs in the air. For a Pokemon villain to have this sort of motivation is maybe unsettling, but also in tune with the reality of the place that inspired these games. As I'm writing this, it even feels a bit prescient. This video will release either shortly before or after a French election that looks likely to swing toward far-right candidates campaigning on the idea that France is only for a certain kind of person. And, just like real fascism, Lysander's plan ultimately escalates all the way to extermination. He announces on national broadcast that he will activate a long-dormant ultimate weapon that will simply murder every man, woman, and child who is not a member of Team Flare. In addition to being extreme and almost shockingly grim, Lysander's actions and beliefs also don't really make any sense. It doesn't all add up, but that's actually part of the point. At the end of the day, slicing through whatever lattice of dog whistles and doublespeak the fascist concocts, he is both simple and objectively wrong. They can be boiled down to a straightforward and disprovable impulse toward illusory superiority by birthright, and it's fun to watch them lose. This should be a compelling climax to a Pokemon story, to storm in and stomp the wannabe totalitarian and save the world. It would be, if it felt like any of this was really happening. One of the great strengths of the 5th generation was that the narrative felt integrated with the setting. Every stop on your journey you learned something or met someone new that advanced the ideas of the game toward a natural conclusion. In X and Y, the plot is something that happens sometimes, interrupting the normal flow of gameplay. All the encounters with Team Flare feel cordoned off from the standard regression of gyms and badges, the gym leaders being mostly non-characters uninterested in the active paramilitary hanging out in city limits. Each battle with Team Flare's admittedly cool-looking admins adds repetition but no further nuance to the antagonists. They think beauty is more important than people, and that's really all any of them have to say. Moreover, the villains' convictions just don't firmly connect to the world of Pokemon. Black and White raised the idea of Pokemon battling as abusive, and Black and White 2 stated that all Pokeballs may be oppressive. In contrast, X and Y's conflict, while more intense on paper, is generalizable, its bullet points not specific to the universe it inhabits. As a result, it often feels distant. The story design of these games invited politics in, but ultimately left them on the doormat. Does modern Kalos have a head of state or governing body at all? Does it actually experience the resource scarcity Lysander alludes to, or was that a total fabrication? For that matter, are there any social problems whatsoever? Still, we have no idea. In order to tell a complete story with this sort of antagonist, Pokemon had to be more willing to depict a difficult and complicated space. Instead, Kalos is, as we experience it, an easy utopia. A country genuinely free of unhappiness or pain is not the sort of place where someone like Lysander gets a foothold in the first place, though. So while yes, X and Y rightfully end up refuting their villain's fascism, they are going to do so without a complete argument. The systems of play, I repeat myself, are not being allowed to consciously touch the story, and Mega Evolutions are a bit of a contradiction. It took me a while, but now it is time to talk about the Megas. X and Y introduced a flashy new mechanic where Pokemon from past generations could evolve an additional time into a stronger form, but with limitations. It can only be triggered within battles and automatically reverts at their end. It is only accessible to a couple dozen Pokemon, each one tied to an often difficult to find held item. These restrictions make sense because it is a fundamentally powerful concept. When analyzing games as stories, it is this sort of centerpiece mechanic that is usually worth zooming in on, the thing that provides the striking point. Across this section, we will look perhaps too closely at Mega Evolution as well as follow X and Y's plot to its conclusion, and in that combination try to discover what the games say, intended or not. The integration of Mega Evolution into the story treats the process with almost mystical reverence. Access to it is not just a convenient upgrade, but a rare and sacred privilege. It is also, though, introduced rather early. Chalor City is home to both the 3rd gym and the eye-catching Tower of Mastery. Within the tower, the player supposedly proves their worth as an extraordinarily talented and driven trainer, earning their right to possess a Mega Ring and therefore utilize Mega Evolution. The experts who study the phenomenon claim this represents your uniquely deep trust and powerful bonds with your partner Pokemon. But this is a bit sudden, right? You, the player character, are at this point barely a quarter of the way to even qualifying for the Pokemon League, yet you are already the most worthy of this exclusive honor? And Megas are exclusive. Only 3 NPCs across the whole main story use them, and that's including the tutorial battle. Serena, your main rival, badly wants a Mega Ring as well, but she is flatly denied after losing to you. There is only one ring apparently, and it's yours, whether you really care or not. X and Y did need both to present Mega Evolution with an air of prestige and to make sure everyone could comfortably access it. The Chalor gym leader just donates a Mega Ready Lucario to you, which is stunningly awkward if you already raised one yourself, and whichever Kanto starter you chose can access their Mega not long after too. What they didn't need to do is keep it away from nearly all the game's interesting trainers. The player will likely view that animation with the pink shell and DNA burst hundreds of times to the point of it becoming thoughtless routine. They will have to overcome fighting against a Mega Evolved Pokemon twice. This placing of the player character on a pedestal above everyone else is frustrating because it undercuts Pokemon's theme of community. The locations of Pokemon games are generally marked by harmony between people, the antagonistic team being the sole exception that prioritizes personal gain. Kalos is written rather sparsely, but still finds some opportunities to reinforce that idea. There is a peculiar tipping mechanic for various service workers and performers, and while button mashing will default to tipping nothing, very European, it persists as a chance for the player to selflessly contribute to a greater good. A minor moment of environmental storytelling occurs when clearing Team Flare out of the power plant solves the blackout that had been plaguing North Lumio City. A power plant is a universally beneficial public good, and so stopping Flare's monopoly on electricity is obviously correct. And the aforementioned conflict between Shabano Castle and Parfum Palace establishes that wherever inequality does exist in this society, it should be addressed. The strongest example of this theme of many over few occurs again with a story of the distant past and is, for my money, X and Y's most poignant writing. A whole 3,000 years ago, a vicious war ravaged Kalos, claiming the lives of people and Pokemon alike. Even the king's precious Floette was killed. In his grief, this ancient king of Kalos built a machine capable of bringing it back to life. It succeeded, but the king still overcome with fury, that same machine was turned into a weapon, massacring the opposing army and ending the war. However, the revived Floette abandoned the king because it knew that the power used to resurrect it was derived by draining the life force of countless other Pokemon instead. And so the king, even in victory, ends up bereft of what truly matters. This sordid tale is told rather bluntly in a sort of PowerPoint presentation, but is a compelling story structure and conveys a distinct political message. To sacrifice the many for the sake of one, to in general believe oneself superior to others, is a deep sin. It also connects thematically and materially to Lysander's plots. Team Flare's ultimate weapon is that same ancient machine unearthed, which takes the form of a giant crystal flower. The stones surrounding Geosenge Town were, it turns out, gravestones of the Pokemon sacrificed in that millennia-old struggle. And that ancient king is still alive, irradiated by his creation and cursed with immortality, wandering endlessly, holding nothing but regret. His name is AZ, and he is a miserable and tortured character. Lysander knows all this and still plows ahead. He even meets and imprisons AZ, an ancestor of his who represents his own future should he succeed, and still robs him of the key needed to activate the ultimate weapon without a second thought. This is not someone who can be reasoned into stopping at this point. Right before you're shepherded to the climactic location, Flare's top scientist makes the player choose between two buttons, one of which will supposedly stop the weapon. Of course, even if you guess right, nothing happens. An odd little moment, the point is that fascists don't play by the rules, even their own. You do just have to fight them. Mega Evolution, one might imagine, could be the player's secret weapon in the fight against Team Flare. The game clearly looks down on the villain's devaluation of life, their belief that the world will be more beautiful with fewer living things. Mega Evolution is associated symbolically with life, represented by the double helix of DNA. It is powered supposedly by the trust between trainer and Pokemon, two different life forms, to create something beautiful together. This bidirectionality stands it opposite to the ultimate weapon, which can only steal life toward something else. Confined in the basement of a secret laboratory is the primary power source of said weapon, the obligate legendary Pokemon of Kalos, Xerneas in X and Yveltal in Y. They seem to represent life and death respectively. Xerneas is said to infuse its life force into surrounding organisms, while Yveltal saps it away. Both appear in times of conflict and undergo centuries-long patterns of hibernation and revival. Each version of the game features just one with only the barest mention of the other, which does give the climax of each game a noticeably different character. X and Y essentially treats these two superficially very different creatures as interchangeable. However, it actually speaks to the game's occasional capacity for clever writing that it functions just as well either way. This horrible machine, capable of both resurrection and destruction, can be powered by either the life god or the death god. It's all on the same coin. And even though Yveltal causes death, it is not treated as malicious by the game, but a natural force. Even though it is wrong, obviously, that Team Flare wants to kill almost everyone, death is not inherently bad but a necessary aspect of life. We see with AZ that immortality is not the answer. Flare's real transgression then was declaring themselves arbiters of a pre-existing natural cycle, perverting it for the sake of their own hubris. The set piece of reviving the legendary and capturing it in a unique arena is compelling if brief. While a missed opportunity that the legendaries play a fairly minor role in the plot, there are, I think, some strong ideas here. Life is beautiful and, when the time comes, so is death. By requiring the player catch either Xerneas or Yveltal, the game communicates that you can only succeed with nature on your side. You cannot ignore it and expect to prosper. It is a shame, then, that the capture mechanic involves total domination rather than true cooperation, but I'm getting ahead of myself. One of the most prevalent East Asian folktales is that of the simple carp which against all odds climbs a roaring waterfall and thus becomes a dragon. It serves as a common metaphor for all sorts of struggle in life and promises, wisely or not, that great feats of perseverance will be powerfully rewarded. This legend is the whole concept behind Magikarp and Gyarados. Just keep splashing and one day you'll learn Hyper Beam. Lysander believes himself to already be a dragon. He has scaled the particular waterfall of modern society and become the archetype for today's most powerful people, a stunningly wealthy corporate oligarch. Furthermore, he is entirely accepting that status accurately determines people's worth, that only dragons are truly valuable, and that anyone who is still a carp is dragging everyone else down. His signature Pokemon is a Gyarados. One last complication to his character is that, when admitting that his plan will kill every Pokemon in the world, he cries. What this does is confirm sincerity. Despite all the absurdity and leaps of logic in his stated worldview, it's not just a smokescreen to gain power, but somehow what he truly believes. Lysander genuinely thinks all Pokemon should die. So why the fuck can he use Mega Evolution? Lysander's signature Pokemon is a Mega Gyarados. The ultimate battle against him is the first full battle the player encounters an opponent who can also use a Mega. Sorry, but I think this breaks the entire story as I understand it. Mega Evolution is about love and trust, so why can the astoundingly evil fascist use it just as well? Because he can cry? Is that it? Unfortunately, I have to think that the core reason for this dissonance is that Pokemon games are not stories. They're games that, sometimes, do a story in the middle. Mega Evolution was conceived as a fun mechanic and optimized for maximum coolness. Whether it interacted appropriately with the themes of the story simply was not a real concern. Fitting with the broader design philosophy, there is virtually no friction in the actual use of Megas. The only tangible restriction is that only one Pokemon can Mega Evolve per battle, which was likely just a necessary balancing tactic. X and Y make sure that you, precious consumer, can use Mega Evolution to your heart's content and feel special for doing so. Saving opposing Megas for only the main villain and champion battles simply ups the exclusivity factor. The gameplay simply disproves the story's earlier claim that Mega Evolution is about the bond between trainer and Pokemon. It never requires proof that you treat your Pokemon well, despite the presence of an already implemented mechanic that could have done that, nor does it inflict any punishment for overusing it. And Lysander's Gyarados never disobeys him. Wouldn't that have been cool and cohesive? If he tried to use his Mega Ring but in some way or another failed? Just isn't what we get this time. Pokemon's player characters are all about wish fulfillment, of course, and X and Y took that to another level with the new customization options and array of mostly tacky clothing. Introducing any storytelling nuance to the flagship marketing gimmick would risk lightly stepping on that fantasy, which for Pokemon is a worse result than stomping on the face of its narrative. The player is a dragon, and everyone else is a carp. At the end of it all, the theme of community and selflessness is kinda just discarded. The player is always the strongest person in the room by natural talent, and they win all the prizes. Characters like Serena simply can't complete their arc under those conditions. She is deeply frustrated by her inability to keep up with you, but that doesn't resolve later. You're just better, and that's too bad for her. She's left to just waffle nonsense in the final encounter about both sides being flawed. Like, what? And that's that. What's worse is that it fails to conclusively show why Lysander was so wrong. People don't become dragons. We're all carp all the time, even those on top of the waterfall. No one is inherently superior. But according to Pokemon X and Y, some people are superior, and they don't even have to be interesting. Those people shouldn't try to do genocide, but they do exist, which itself affirms some of the fascists' underlying beliefs about the world. The message at the end of all this is that life is the source of beauty, not the other way around. To go against that natural fact is an abomination that will inevitably result in self-destruction. When Lysander is defeated, he simply tries to fire the ultimate weapon anyway, blowing himself up and dying in the process. Because nature, represented by the box legendary, was not on his side, he was always destined to fail. But seemingly included under nature is all of the structures of modern Pokemon society. There is no way for the player character to ever transgress. The result is that, even with Lysander buried under rubble, the conclusion feels unsatisfying, his ideology defeated only half-heartedly, and with no indicated culpability on anyone else for how close he got to mass murder. Malva, an Elite Four member, was affiliated with Team Flare but just gets to keep her position apparently. And, Sycamore was a close friend of Lysander who effusively praises him early in the game. They didn't have to write him like that, but they did, and yet don't seem to have considered that it makes him fucking complicit in all this. I'm sorry, I don't care how hot he is, Professor Sycamore would not have survived the Kalos Nuremberg trials. Following the player conquering the Elite Four and Champion, a sequence which is gorgeously animated but carries zero narrative weight, a parade is thrown. AZ appears in the middle and requests a battle. After this short exhibition match, that long-lost Floette finally returns to him after 3,000 years of absence. You've seen the memes. This scene has some juice. But, okay, how was a standard Pokemon battle what finally redeemed AZ after millennia of torment? This choice is unintentionally revealing of the only truly consistent message that matters to this series. The solution to all problems is playing more Pokemon. What never matters is what playing Pokemon actually is. Okay, that last section got slightly intense, so I'm gonna take it down a notch. Watching that original trailer for X and Y as a freshman in high school, the most exciting shot was this one, the power plant in the Badlands. It reminded me a lot of Colosseum's distinctive desert grit. Ultimately, it was kind of misleading because you don't get to go there, just look at it from afar. This isn't something I would consider a serious problem today, but it is sort of a mirror of my feelings on the writing of X and Y and even Pokemon at large. A lot of extremely talented artists pour their hearts into each one of these games. Even the story writing, de-emphasized as it is, contains tons of evident passion and desire to create something captivating and thought-provoking. There are lots of little things about X and Y that would only exist if a bunch of people who worked on the game cared about storytelling. Near the 8th gym exists a Pokemon village, inhabited by trainerless Pokemon who were victims of abuse in the past and have formed their own independent community. This place would have fit in perfectly with the narrative of the 5th generation and is evidence that there is latent interest in story elements that challenge traditional Pokémon structures. In the post-game, you can play a whole series of detective vignettes featuring a homeless teenager with a secret identity, lending Lumiose some of the roughness and complexity it lacked in the main story. And Sun and Moon, despite sidelining Mega Evolution in the gameplay, added a layer to it by specifying that it causes the Pokémon pain to perform, which strikes me as an idea almost certainly originally crafted for X and Y but cut for tonal reasons. I guess the problem is that the games as holistic products tend to not respect their own writers. It is so rare for them to go more than a step out of their way to benefit the story, and the result tends to be a muddled, contradictory narrative. The ideas are there, but they are not to be explored, only glimpsed. And you can catch as many Pokémon in Pokémon Village as you want with no repercussions. Of course, many people will have an understandable it's not that deep bro type reaction to this video, so I want to be clear that this is all fun for me. For all the rather unkind things I said about them here, I am not angry at X and Y. It is satisfying to return to a game I have fond memories of, break it down, and stack it back up in my mind as best I can, even if that stack ends up structurally unsound. I thoroughly enjoyed my replay of the game for the most part, and there are a good few more kind things I could have said about it if I was writing a different style of video. The soundtrack in particular absolutely holds up, just beautiful music. Best soundtrack in the series? I think that's my opinion. And, as has been said by many before me, it is a shame that they didn't get a chance to fix the bad ideas and expand on the good ones. Maybe next year's Legends ZA will finally take that opportunity. We can only hope. Condensing all the analytical thoughts about Pokémon that have been swirling in my head for years and years into YouTube videos has been a fun process. It has also arguably launched a whole new career for me, like successful wildly beyond my expectations. However, I think I am running into my own personal limitations here. I ended up repeating more ideas from my Gen 5 videos in this one than I was hoping to. They're all generally contingent on Pokemon's mechanics not letting the storylines breathe. I felt some deja vu. And in order to say anything further, I would have to simply know more about the series, but Gen 6 is where my personal history with Pokemon essentially ends. With the help of Omega Ruby, I completed my genuine childhood dream of the National Pokédex in X, excluding Mythicals, and that turned out to be a serendipitous time to finally do that. In 2017, I started Pokemon Moon, and for reasons I can't even remember, I just fell away from it and never finished. Haven't played a new mainline game since. Part of this is just growing up, of course, but I still play every new Mario and Zelda game. Pokemon just lost me somewhere, and it's impossible to say exactly how much of that was age and how much X and Y's underwhelming qualities may have contributed. And now that I somehow have a stadium's worth of people staring at me, it feels irresponsible to not say that I'm not an expert. I'm just not the right guy to try to wrap this all up into actually saying anything mildly profound about Pokemon. Now, I could play some of the newer games for the first time and find something interesting to say, I'm sure, but I would still lack that personal connection to the experience of playing it just as a game on release, something I leaned on in writing my previous videos. Playing Sun or Shield or Violet now would be tinged with the feeling of research, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but maybe just isn't what I want, especially when I'm being pulled in so many other compelling directions. So I think for now I'd like to open the discussion to the audience. How do the mechanics of other Pokemon games interact with their narratives? Are there other examples of clear contradictions? Are there times where there's a surprising amount of harmonization? Any cool video essays that use that lens? Which particular fan games have really experimented with the Pokemon formula in a way that I might find interesting? Which indie games inspired by Pokemon have truly accomplished something new and intriguing? Really, lay it all on me, I'd love to hear all your thoughts. I may not respond to many comments, but I do read nearly all of them. Please let me know. I may write about Pokemon again someday, and I may not, but it will never be something I don't care about. So, keep in touch. Sincerely, Sky. Thank you so much for watching to the end. This video was supported by my patrons with special thanks to Cass R, Blank912, and Fidel Ubad. For $1 a month, you can join the names on screen and get early access to new videos. If you enjoyed this video, you can like and subscribe, but you don't have to. If you really liked it, you can share it around on Discord or Twitter or Reddit or what have you, but I can't make you do that either. This might end up being my last Pokemon video, so I just wanted to say thank you one last time to everyone who watched them and listened to my endless thoughts. It actually changed my life. Pokemon was never supposed to be a main focus of my channel though, so I hope at least some of you will stick with me for all the other things I'm going to talk about, as long as nobody stops me. Really, this is all just the beginning. Also, if my voice sounded weird in this video, I had bronchitis while recording most of it. I still kinda have it, I think. As always, I've been Skyhoppers, and I'll see you in the next one.